The questions I want to discuss include, why was 9/11 wrong? For that matter, what's wrong with murder, robbery, kidnapping, and rape? Now, we all know that murder, robbery, kidnapping, and rape are wrong, but could we explain why? It's not simply a question of legality. You could say it's against the law, but during the history of the United States, slavery has been perfectly legal. It wasn't against the law, and yet slavery is immoral, if anything is immoral. Consuming alcohol as a beverage by the drink, so far as I can see, is perfectly moral, as opposed to public drunkenness or drunk driving, and yet during the Noble Experiment, it was illegal. So you can't answer the question why something is wrong merely by referring to the law. Several answers have been proposed to this question. For example, Michael Ruse, a Canadian philosopher of biology, and E.O. Wilson, the noted naturalist from Harvard, have suggested there are three alternatives for founding morality. One is biology, the second is religion, and the third is some abstract domain. From biology, they recommend ideas such as selfish genes, the idea that genes want to perpetuate themselves from generation to generation as a possible source of morality, but obviously that could motivate, for example, a serial rapist, and is clearly not an adequate foundation for an understanding of morality. Another is the notion of kin selection, namely that you tend to favor or give preference to individuals in relation to their genetic proximity to you. Well, that's certainly compatible with, say, hiring a cousin who's incompetent over a more qualified stranger for a job, and that's certainly not moral. The third is the idea of reciprocal altruism, or you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But a typical example that contradicts that notion is insider trading. Marcia Stewart went to jail. Bill Frist may well yet for insider trading. That's certainly no basis for morality. Or social cooperation. Social cooperation sounds promising until you consider that there are many organizations, such as the Mafia or the Third Reich, that show a high degree of social cooperation. And it's very clear that what they are doing is not moral acts. So what about religion? Well, we seem to have three alternatives when it comes to religion. We have religious leaders, we have religious books, we have religious doctrines. I'll never forget the day after 9/11, standing in my kitchen with my wife. We had the 700 Club on, and Jerry Falwell was there talking with Pat Robertson about the events of the previous day. And Jerry was saying to Pat, well, you know, Pat, I think that it's just God's punishment because we have too many lesbians and homosexuals, too many abortions, and the ACLU. And I turned to my wife and I said, what's this ACLU thing? And I'll tell you, I'm going to explain it, but it took me a while to sort it out. And it certainly wasn't obvious on the face of it. So you have that, and one of these religious leaders, Pat Robertson, has advocated the assassination of Hugo Chavez. Now, this is very peculiar to me because we have here an exemplification of what I call Old Testament Christians. They seem to remember all the punitive doctrines of the Old Testament, where God is a God of vengeance and revenge, and none of the doctrine of love and compassion that Christ taught. So I find this a very anomalous attitude or display of values to be coming from persons who pose as Christian ministers. What about books? Hey, you can find a lot of moral maxims in the Bible. The Bible is, of course, an interesting work because it's central to both Judaism and Christianity. But just, you might want to ask yourself about the morality of some of the maxims that you can find there. For example, Leviticus 20:10 says, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Now, some may think that's a high price to pay for an affair, but there it is, Leviticus 20:10. Compare Leviticus 20:27. A man or a woman who is a medium or a spiritualist among you must be put to death. And I think of Dionne Warwick and the Psychic Network, that I've seen promoted on television, and I just say, well, they must be written off. Here's one of my favorites. Leviticus 29. If anyone curses his father or mother, he must not be grounded, not be sent to his room, not be deprived of television for a week. No, put to death. And I just wonder how many of you sitting here today would be here if we had implemented that moral maxim. Well, what that suggests, of course, is that we can't simply take what we find, what we hear from religious leaders, or what we find in a good book for granted. You're going to have to exercise your intellect. Here's another illustration. As far as doctrines are concerned, Islam believes there should be no sex outside of marriage and no consumption of alcohol. And when I shared this with my students, I found a noticeable lack of enthusiasm for conversion. Osama, of course, told us why he was upset with us a long time ago, namely that our policy toward Palestine was so lopsided in favor of Israel on the one hand, and because American forces were stationed in Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina, which he considered to be a sacrilege. It seems to me those were perfectly legitimate reasons for having a beef with the United States. Yet, of course, when 9/11 transpired, an event which Osama would deny having had any role in bringing about, the President of the United States and his cronies immediately started assailing those evildoers who hate America and its freedoms. When we ponder the whole situation, as I'll develop it here, this remark from the President of the United States has many ironic dimensions. But a Bible can be used to justify doctrines such as slavery, sexism, homophobia. Does any of this sound familiar? How about that women should be completely subservient to their husbands? That's something that the Bible has been often used to support. Perhaps we can turn to religious doctrines then. The problem is that we confront the difficulty that all of these theological beliefs are empirically untestable. So that if you believe there's one God or no gods, no one can show you're wrong either way. I've often suggested to my students that it makes at least as much sense to envision God as a woman as to envision God as a man, for the obvious reason that if God is the creator, then at least women can give birth, which is something no man can do. If I stand here before you now and say there are exactly 327 gods, who among you can show that I'm wrong? The fact of the matter being, you can believe anything you want as an article of faith, and evidence doesn't impact upon it. A completely different attitude, by the way, than the scientific attitude, because scientific claims are conditional, testable, and held in a tentative fashion, whereas these articles of faith are unconditional, they're non-testable, and they're held to be absolute truths. Ultimately, it turns out that morality provides a motive for morality, but not a source of morality. And indeed, even the Catholic Church has admonished us to exercise our reason to discover what is true in terms of morality so that we can know what God would have us do, predicated on an ancient debate about whether an action is right because God wills it, or does God will it because it's right. I mean, if God could will slavery and sexism and racism, then would that make it morally right? Pretty clearly no. So that what theologians refer to as the goodness of God would have us contemplate by the exercise of our own reason what is moral, that we should know thereby what God would have us do. Now, Roos and Wilson thought that the idea of appealing to an abstract domain was an unsatisfactory foundation for morality, but I think they simply didn't understand how we go back and forth in assessing moral principles in relation to clear cases which are not in doubt. If murder, kidnapping, robbery, and rape, for example, are cases of immoral action, as we would all agree, then any theory Any theory of morality that does not qualify them as immoral actions ought to be on that basis rejected. So, what have philosophers done? Well, they've tried to develop theories about the nature of morality that might clarify and illuminate what goes on here, not only in moral discourse, but as a guide for action. Three of the most important moral theories are so-called consequentialist accounts, which evaluate the rightness or wrongness of an action in terms of its production of the good. The nature of the good has been subject to debate, where happiness, pleasure, power, knowledge, and money have all been advanced as candidates. But some of those are obviously inadequate. For example, the good is supposed to be that which is intrinsically valuable in and of itself. Money obviously doesn't qualify. Money is valued as a means for what it can do in terms of accomplishing goals. Suppose, for example, I said I'm going to give you $1 million. There's one constraint. You can't spend it. Most of us would say, why bother, right? That would simply be a frustrating situation. So money is not a very plausible candidate. Most philosophers contemplating these issues would be inclined to think happiness is the proper foundation, and maximizing happiness, one action is preferable to another when it produces more happiness. On the other hand, we'll find attitudes toward power make a difference to understanding contemporary events. Thus, if you talk about making decisions and maximizing happiness, the question becomes for whom? There are three different possible candidates: the individual himself, the group with which he identifies, or for everyone. And you respectively produce the moral theories known as ethical egoism, limited utilitarianism, and classic utilitarianism. A limited utilitarian is someone who acts so as to maximize happiness for themselves, regardless of the consequences for others. So, nice examples that show that this won't define the nature of morality include Ted Bundy, John Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or I would suggest Larry Silverstein. Limited utilitarianism now expands for the group and defines an action as right when it produces at least as much happiness for group G as any alternative. Now, counterexamples to limited utilitarianism include the Third Reich, the Mafia, and General Motors. Look at the Third Reich, for example. It practiced military aggression, territorial conquest, systematic genocide, all to advance the interests of a group, the Aryan nation, Hitler and his cronies. The reason why limited utilitarianism is so much more dangerous than ethical egoism, because groups of individuals can exercise vastly more power and influence than any mere single person themselves. Thus, I consider limited utilitarianism to be the most dangerous of all moral philosophies. But it tends to correspond to what we find exemplified by our own government's attitudes and policies. For example, the intervention in the Middle East, which appears to have been driven out of motives related to oil, ideology, and Israel, about which I shall have more to say. Classic utilitarianism then says an action is right when it maximizes happiness for everyone. Now, what that means is you have to take into account how much happiness it produces and subtract how much unhappiness it produces. So you're dealing with net quantities in order to determine the net happiness produced by subtracting one from the other. This is a very appealing position about moral philosophy because it is exemplified by the writing of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, the idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Many of you here will believe right now as I'm speaking that it's the foundation or the rationale for the democratic political process. But pause and consider. The greatest happiness for the greatest number might be produced by, say, a slave-based society in which 85% are going to be masters and 15% slaves. While the slaves aren't very happy about it, the masters might be so much more elated to have someone to mow their lawns, change the diapers, do the dishes, everything else you can imagine you might want a slave to do, that possibly if you get the division and the proportion just right,